It's a beautiful day, and we're glad to have you join us as always on Budget Podcast. Thank you for always staying with us. Thank you for your comments. Thank you for your observations. Thank you for your contribution as well. My name is Nancy Adumego, and I'll be taking you through the first episode for the year 2022. Well, it's no news that the 2022 budget is out, and along with it came lots of discoveries, by different civil society organizations. Actually, the topic is making trends on media, airwaves, and the rest of it. And we have some great minds who would be joining us to, let us really understand what is actually lying behind this particular budget, some of its significance, as well as recommendations that could follow on it. Joining me in the conversation today is Kalu Aja, a financial planner, as well as Abel Akeni. He's the head of research and policy advisory at Budget Foundation. Hi, Abel. Hi, Kalu. So good to have you join us.
Hi, Nancy.
Hello, Nancy. How are you doing today?
I'm fine, actually. Thank you so much. Okay, so we're just going to go right into it. It's no news to us that the 2022 budget is out already, yes, and a budget recently released its discovery in the 2022 budget. There were some duplicated items that were there, over 460. So I think let's just have a general assessment of what the 2022 budget is all about, and let us have more insight on the discoveries and how they were identified. So let's start with Abel here. Abel, so just take us through the 2022 budget, just roughly here and there. And you can also cite some of the MDAs where these particular duplicated items were identified.
All right, thank you very much, Nancy. It's a pleasure to be here once again. So I guess the first starting point for me would be to highlight, in terms of assessing the budget, that one of the biggest issues with the budget, it has to do with budget realism. And I'll start out by pointing out the revenue projections for 2022, which is put at about 10.74 trillion. This is a big concern, largely because Nigeria has never done, or the federal government itself has never raised up to 5 trillion anywhere in the past 6 years. And there are no radically new strategies, revenue generation strategies, that are convincing enough to put the mind at ease that we will hit this target. And this is a big problem, because once we face a scenario where revenue targets are missed, the implication is that we are either going to push the country into more debt than projected, or we are going to have a lot of abandoned projects littering the length and breadth of this country, because the different MDAs in the country enter into agreements with contractors based on how much revenue they expect the country to make. And then if the projection is a bit besides reality, we would face situations where we enter into contracts that we cannot realistically fund during the lifespan of that contract. So that's one of the big concerns, the budget and realism issues. But moving away from those projections, there are also problems with the expenditures. There are expenditure inefficiencies, and there are outright loopholes for fraud in the budget. And one of the ones the media is quite concerned with has to do with duplicated projects in the budget. So this took two forms. One of the forms is scenarios in which you see a single line item repeated more than once. In such situations, you could have, in reality, when implementation starts, the budget for one of such items will be implemented, whereas the budget for the other will find its way into private pockets, but the project will still be reported as completed. So I will give an example with the provision of transformers, 500 kVA transformers in Ilaro for 250 million. And then we have the same project repeated again for provision of transformers exactly the same location, the same spelling, the same allocation occurring twice under the same MDA. And we have similar scenarios like that. In some cases, the same project budgeted for by one MDA is also repeated in a different agency. So we have the provision of solar-powered boreholes in specific areas in Katsina South Senatorial District by the Upper Niger River Basin Development Authority. And then we have the Ministry of Water Resources headquarters also providing solar-powered boreholes in the same locations. So we have scenarios like that across the budget, across several ministries, which is a cause for concern. The other form, duplicated project stake, the other forms they actually assumed in the 2022 budget were scenarios where an otherwise unique ERGP code was used for more than one project. So typically in the budget, every capital project has a unique identifier. But we've seen scenarios where more than one project are being tagged with the same unique identifier. And that can create a loophole for fraud, especially when that's been reported or when when implementation of the project starts. But this is even one of the smallest issues for concern in the budget, because this can be quite easily blocked at the level of the Ministry of Finance. Disbursement of funds can be stopped to such projects. Other larger issues have to do with projects that are assigned or allocated to ministries that are outside the capacities of those ministries to deliver them, or that are outside the mandate of those ministries to deliver them. And I'll give 2 quick examples. We have the National Center for Agricultural Mechanization, which should be responsible for mechanizing the way we conduct agriculture in this country. But we have that same agency being responsible for constructing half of a secondary school in Lagos State. We also have the Nigeria Stored Products Research Institute in Ilorin, also constructing the other half of the same secondary school. And this secondary school is the Femi Gbajabiamila Public Secondary School in Itire. So the Agricultural Mechanization Center is constructing block A, B, and C. And then you have another agency, the Stored Product Research Institute, constructing block D, E, and F, all for the total of 1.4 billion. And this is a project in the first place. Both agencies don't even have the capacity, or would I say the mandate, to implement. If we move on to another agency like the Nigerian Institute for Oceanography and Marine Research, we find this agency now constructing street lights in Ovioma Agege's senatorial district in Delta Central Senatorial District. And then we have several examples of agencies that are now being redirected or that have broadened the definition of their mandates to allow them carry out or to allow them award contracts that are very easy to manipulate or to basically nominate their own candidates for such contracts. So I think that's an area of big concern, because there are powerful politicians and powerful vested interests behind such distortions, and it's more difficult to get these people to back down. We have the Nigerian Export Promotion Council purchasing motorcycles for constituency projects for different legislators. So if we have agencies that are supposed to help Nigeria export more, we have agencies that are supposed to help Nigeria improve or reduce post-harvest losses and improve the quality of our agriculture. But these agencies have been taken over by vested interests for other projects, running into hundreds of billions of naira. It's a cause for concern, because a lot of those monies will end up finding their ways into private pockets, and ultimately citizens would be unable to get value for money. So I'll just stop here by saying there is a lot of expenditure inefficiencies with the budget, and there are a lot of loopholes for fraud that need to be looked at critically.
All right, thank you so much, Abel. I mean, that was really elaborate.
Yeah, it's just depressing information, more or less. I mean, the budget IT does they just do a fantastic job in just bringing this out so we can even talk about it, but it's just depressing, really. Yeah.
All right. Yeah. Thank you so much. Thank you, Abel, by the way. So, Kalu, let me have you on this one. With all of these issues, right? The duplication, same location, same project, different agencies. Look at the example Abel cited, construction of a block of classroom was carried out by 2 different agencies. So in this particular issue, would you now say, or do you think Nigeria has a revenue problem, or would you rather say we have an expenditure problem?
Yeah, great question, Nancy. So I'm coming at it from the personal finance angle, right? And you can clearly see that Nigeria has a spending problem. Okay. And it's pretty easy to see. Spending is a choice. Revenue, yeah, you can classify revenue, but how you spend money is a choice. That's really the short answer. And there are lots of examples, apart from what Abel has given. In 1970s, Nigeria had the oil boom, right? Where we had tons of revenue, tons. The president was quoted as saying, the head of state back then, that Nigeria's problem is not money, but how to spend money. That was a quote right there. Yeah. From 1970 to 1973, Nigeria did not spend up to 1% on education on the federal budget. From 1970 till 1973, none of these years in the oil boom did we spend up to a percentage on education. From 1960 to 1990, only 1 year did Nigeria spend more than 10% on education. So the revenue argument falls away when you look at how we are actually allocating the revenues that we do get. This year, Abel has given us the figures, right? But this year is a massive spending of about 13 trillion on fuel subsidies. That is more than the capital allocation to build roads, bridges, and all that. Just subsidy on the PMS. So you want to ask yourself, what's more important to Nigerians? Is it the roads and the rails to drive on and reduce the cost of doing business, or the cost of importing PMS for Nigerians? It's important, but what's the priority really now? Is it healthcare, education, or is it cheap PMS? And that's the decision point we're talking about, and that's the spending. So Nigeria does have a spending problem, not a revenue problem. The bucket is leaking. It has just one problem. That's how I look at it.
Oh, okay. So the problem is that we don't know how to spend our money, but we get good inflow of money.
The problem is that we have a misallocation and we are not optimizing our revenues, both the fiscal the revenues and of course the carbon revenues that are coming from the gift in quotes of crude oil. It's not been allocated properly. Abel has just given us a rundown of how raw materials research and ocean fishes are building streetlights. That is also expenditure, and that would look like capital expenditure. Yeah. But the net effect of that spend is suboptimal. So it's not the revenues. If Nigeria's revenue triples, then we'll build, instead of a 5 billion library in NAS, we'll build a 50 billion revenue library in NAS. So it's just, we spend when the money comes and we lock the spending in, but the revenues are not locked in. So we then have this debt. So the problem is not that we don't make enough money, it's that the money we get, we're not spending it properly to generate wealth and improve productivity down the line.
All right, thank you so much for that thought. So let's have Abel here. Abel, what would you say regarding your thoughts right now on the effect of federal government's public spending, as captured in the 2022 budget? Because if you look at it, now I'm talking about the effect on both the economy and on the citizens. The government is also saying they are projecting they'll be able to, contain inflation to some extent and grow the GDP by 4.2%. So let me have your perspective on this.
Okay. So thank you, Nancy, for that particular question. And if I will build on what has been said here, in reality, the spending we have, especially as outlined in the budget, is not exactly optimal. But let's go back to why we even have a budget in the first place. Typically, budgets are supposed to fund a strategy. Budgets are supposed to fund our development plan. And those plans have targets. They have aspirations in terms of what's the quality of life you would want for Nigeria, what's the agricultural production output you expect to see, what's our GDP growth rate, what's the job creation projection. Those are targets that can be achieved with the development plan. But the development plan only exists on paper if the budget is not fully optimized or fully aligned with our development plan. A lot of the things we have in the 2022 budget are besides what was initially promised in the development plan. So if we have a budget that is not adequately funding the National Development Plan 2021 to 2025, what is the guarantee that we are going to meet the targets promised in that plan? So that's the concern. So if you have a plan and you're not working towards the plan, you're not financing that plan, it just raises doubt as to the seriousness or the feasibility of achieving the targets in that plan. And let's keep in mind, the current National Development Plan 2021 to 2022 was actually launched late. I think it was launched in late 2021, meaning that it wasn't used in the 2021 budget. So within that 5-year plan, we've lost 1 year. And then coming to 2022, we should at least fund some of the federal government components in that National Development Plan. We see a serious misalignment between the brilliant promises in that plan versus the reality of where the money will be flowing to in 2022. So I think there could be a lot of missed targets as a result of the way the current spending is outlined in the budget. But beyond that, there is a concern on if the government will effectively be able to control inflation, especially food inflation. Because if you think about what's driving food inflation, part of it is reduced production or some sort of scarcity in the production of food. Part of it also has to do with inefficiencies in our agricultural production system. Part of it also has to do with a lot of post-harvest losses that reduce the quality of food, the quality and quantity of food that make it into the market from our local farms. And ultimately, we end up importing some food products, and then the ones locally available are a bit high, and the prices keep rising. But then the agencies that should be responsible for containing this situation, agencies that should be responsible for introducing new research and new ways to store our products and reduce post-harvest losses, those agencies are right now, they have more than 60% of their budgets allocated to constructing street lights, to purchasing motorcycles, and things that have little or nothing to do with their core mandate, but are just easier contracts that can be awarded and basically redirected to vested interest. So if we have a scenario like this, it's a cause for concern, the extent to which the expenditure plan outlined in the budget will achieve the targets promised Nigerians in the National Development Plan. But a larger implication of this would be potential erosion of private sector confidence in the government if we have a lot of loopholes for corruption and a lot of loopholes for fraud and spending inefficiencies. The private sector is also supposed to contribute to funding the National Development Plan. So what's the incentive they have if the little revenue the government is trying to raise is being spent inefficiently, and it's almost going to make its way to private or to personal pockets? Why should the private sector really be committed to the country's development plan? A last effect I would say about the current spending plan is that it will tend to widen the trust deficit between the citizens and the government. Because if you look at all the loopholes for corruption and the billions and billions of naira that's being misallocated to very suspicious areas, it begs the questions, or it raises the questions in the minds of citizens that why is the government saying they don't have revenue if they have this much revenue to spend in certain areas? And this will build up resistance in the minds of people to logical issues like the removal of subsidy and other critical expenditures. Because if the government tries to touch subsidy, an argument citizens can make is, how about the spending inefficiencies you have in the budget? How come you're not optimizing that? We have billions and billions of naira being lost to spending inefficiencies. So I think the government needs to amend this budget or the plans outlined in the budget and then take out some of these worrisome issues so that it begins to build confidence in the citizens and it begins to close the trust deficit between the citizens and the government.
So speaking about the National Development Plan, right, for 2021 to 2025, federal government expects the private sector to contribute over 250 trillion naira, to finance the plan. So now, Carlo, what do you think is the prevailing perspective, in the private sector, especially with respect to them investing in infrastructure and probably contributing significantly to the National Development Plan?
Thanks, Nancy. I say broadly, it's a good plan. Broadly, we already have, should we say, the road infrastructure development refurbishment, is it Act or so, where private sector companies can invest in infrastructure and then get a tax break. So MTN is building a road, I think, in Owerri or so, and they're going to write that off in their books via taxes. So we already have that going on, and it's been broadly accepted by the private sector. BUA, Dangote, many are doing the same all across Nigeria. It's perfect. It's also good because we also have long-term savings now in Nigeria via the pension funds. So you can have long-term funds that you can tie into this. So you have the private balance sheets, the PFAs, and then you have the infrastructure, equity funds and all that. So we have the structure around that we can build on this. Is it going to go up to 250 trillion? It's not even going to get half or a quarter of that. I think the total pension funds in Nigeria, everything is about 13 trillion. And of course, it's got to be allocated all around. How many private sector companies have the balance sheet of MTN or Dangote? So we're not going to get that amount, but I think it's a very, very good way that we can bring the private sector in and get an infrastructure without borrowing. The issue really in Nigeria now is revenue to debt. There's just no revenue, and you have to build infrastructure. The population is growing about 3% per annum. So we have to build new roads, new houses, new schools, and we don't have the money. So this is a perfect idea, but not the amount, but the structure and the intent is in the right place.
Okay, so is there like maybe a specific amount, or maybe an amount you would recommend other than the 250 trillion?
I want more. I'm just thinking that it's not going to be realistic. There's just no way the private sector is going to generate and invest even a quarter of 250 trillion in one fiscal year or in 4 fiscal years. I don't see it, because the laws are there, right? But there's also business companies. This is going to be to invest in this. You imagine a board would have to go past the resolution to say we're going to take revenue or cash from our reserves and we're going to invest in this road. Then you have to make the argument, why are we investing in this road? Is it going to benefit us directly, or is it going to benefit us indirectly? Dangote has and BUA, they run trucks on those roads. So to them, if the roads are good, it helps their. So Apapa Port is being built because they are importers. But the bulk of Nigeria's GDP, where's the money coming from? Services and all that. Would a telecom company or the smaller ones go fix roads in Apapa? They don't import stuff via Apapa. So the use case has to be a bit clearer. So perhaps you want to really push this out more into the rural area. We already have a law that says if you go to rural areas and you invest in electricity, roads, and you provide those services, you can get up to 100% transfer on that expenditure from your taxes as well. So perhaps you have a market where you can say anyone in Nigeria that is doing rural infrastructure, right? You can sell that tax credit to a market, and I, as a multinational or even as a bank, can go buy that tax credit. If you create a market like that, then you then have lots of people that are like in my village. I could build a water pump worth maybe 10 million and then sell the tax revenues, and then a bank could buy it and use it to offset their taxes or offset their import duties. So if you create that market, you get more at the lower base, doing more projects than going for the MTNs and the Dangotes. Maybe that would then increase the volume of rural infrastructure that we can see happening.
All right, thank you so much, Carlos. So let's move over to debt, right? Nigeria's debt, it's no news. It's steadily on the rise, on the increase. So what are your thoughts on the country's rising debt? And probably, are there any alternatives that, Nigerian government can actually consider to kind of lighten our burden? Abel.
So in terms of alternatives, I think the first thing in trashing out a problem is to examine how the problem evolves in the first place. And for the debts we incur, a lot of it comes from scenarios where there is a difference between the revenue we make and the expenditure we expect to incur, which is referred to as our deficit. 2022, we have a deficit of over 6 trillion. So meaning that we would have to borrow as much as that to really be able to finance the expenditure. So the first point I would raise in terms of reducing the growing debt would be to cut out the fat from this deficit. And by fat, I mean those expenditures that are padded, those expenditures that are duplicated, those expenditures that are quite honestly not in line with the National Development Plan and outside the mandates and capacities of certain ministries. We need to trim down on those types of expenditures, and in that way we will reduce the deficit, and then we will reduce the amount of debt we are expected to go to the markets to borrow, both from local lenders or international lenders. So that's one way we can address the debt problem. Reduce the deficit by reducing some of the wastages and suboptimal expenditures. Another way I would say we can turn to is to, and again, this ties into what Carlos said, something very interesting about how private sector is constructing roads, with examples from MTN, Dangote, and the likes. Mm-hmm. Now, the government can build on that road tax infrastructure credit scheme for several other sectors. The government needs to leverage more of public-private partnerships in financing some of its agendas, as opposed to loading everything onto its budget. So, for example, there is a provision for over R1 billion for the construction of several driver training schools across the 6 geopolitical zones. We genuinely believe that a glorified driver training school should not really be the direct or primary priority of the government at a time like this. Those are things that can be handled by the private sector effectively. And then the government just licenses their facilities for the purposes of those trainings. So if we cut out some of those projects we want to do in the budget, but are best done by the private sector, if we outsource them truly to the private sector, we will see a scenario where there is a reduction in our deficits and there's a reduction in the amount of debt we would have to go out and borrow. And this can be done, I mean, what's been done with the road tax infrastructure credit can be done for the health sector. I mean, once the program is introduced, we can have scenarios where people get tax credits for constructing primary healthcare centers, or if you spend 5 million on renovating a healthcare center in your community, you get a tax credit that much. And I mean, as Carlo put it beautifully, you could create a framework where those credits could be sold, or you could even utilize it in your own company. So that would be a very good way for the government to get private sector citizens to really be involved directly in some of these spendings, as opposed to loading everything onto the budget, which has the ultimate effect of widening the deficit or the fiscal deficit in the budget. So I'll say that's one way, or those are some ways, alternative pathways we can take to trim down the amount of debt the country is going to incur going forward.
I would say despite the rising debt in the country, it's quite unfortunate that the level of corruption is also steadily on the rise. I mean, last year we were at what number? This year we are a step higher, or should I say a step lower? Because if you look at the Transparency International, who just released the corruption index, which showed an increased level of corruption in Nigeria, out of 100 points, we are 24. And that is no better from where we were in 2020. So what would you say about this? What's your opinion on this, Carlo?
Yeah, we've been on this transparency index for quite a while, isn't it? And I think it's, if we use the medical term, I think corruption, sadly, in Nigeria is endemic. It's there. And we can try and move 1 or 2 points, 10 basis points and all that, but there's no broad-based, acceptance by the general population and also the business folks doing business with Nigerians, even at the airports and all that, the first point of contact, that corruption has gone down. That's an endemic problem, and I think a big failure, because if we have that messaging that, listen, we are serious about fighting corruption, it does rub off on how you can get investors and how citizens even view the budget and how they connect the budget to their daily lives and paying taxes. But I want to make a point here that sometimes I think is often overlooked. When we have to define really for ourselves what corruption is, right? And many of Nigeria's problems are really based off not corruption, right? But the illegal, quote unquote, corruption of allocation of assets. After the Ajaokuta and really all the steel plants in Nigeria. If you look at where the steel plants in Nigeria, there's one in Katsina, one in Oyo, one in Jos. There's Ajaokuta is near the iron ore mines. If you go back and read how these steel plants and how Ajaokuta was sited and the reasoning behind them and how they were built, Ajaokuta didn't fail because of corruption. It's lots of planning factors that we woke up and we doubled the capacity, or we passed the bill and we said you can only get Forex to build a steel plant if you are making steel. So the Russians imported steel billets from Ukraine and simply produced steel in Ajaokuta to get Forex to do Ajaokuta. This had nothing to do with corruption. What's a steel plant doing in Katsina? What's an oil refinery doing in Kaduna? All these are legal expenses that, because we were not well thought out or attached to a plan, have quote unquote failed. So the the spend that is mal done, that is not done properly, right? It's a very, very big part of this quote unquote corruption of use of public funds. Not just the illegal, I sign a budget, it's approved, it's legal, but how we are abusing the power. What Abel really want to say was that the gentleman that his school is being built by two
different agencies.
Yeah, he's a speaker. So what's going on, right? So he's a speaker, and I'm told just two. So they've gone to the budget and they're like, hey, okay, you want to get approval, you've got to build a school, build that school for $1 billion. Same thing with the other guy building the street lights. So this is the part that those street lights, how do they contribute to the productivity of that state or to the nation? But is it corruption? No, because it's properly signed, the money will be released, it's properly allocated. So it's not corruption, right? But so if we start to expand the definition of corruption to include this allocation of resources and how it affects us, it's the same as the corruption, the effect of corruption. And that's my view.
Right. But if we were to look at inflation, our economy, and possibility of creating more jobs in the country, what do you think the government can do better in this aspect?
Yeah, great question. So inflation is difficult to define and also difficult to see what causes it, right? So, but the most common definition is inflation is too much money chasing too few goods, right?
Yeah, so, definitely.
Yeah, if you look at that definition, so there are two things that can cause inflation. Either you have too much cash or you have too few goods. Yes. I think in Nigeria's case is we have too few goods. So prices in Nigeria are going up. Let's take bag of rice. Bag of rice is going up, or it has stayed up because the production of rice, the supply of rice has not met the demand.
The demand, yes.
Yeah, we see lots of rice mills and all that. But if supply really hits the market, then by basic economics, the price will then start to come down. It's just basic economics. So why is there no supply? Because the Nigerian consumer really has no purchasing power. So let's take the minimum wage has been fixed, I believe, since almost a decade. But gas prices have gone up. Everything in Nigeria price has gone up. The dollar was maybe 117, now it's 414 officially.
Yeah.
Everything has gone up, but the Nigerian consumer, the wage earners' wages have stayed completely flat. So you see a 50 kg bag of rice is unaffordable. So they make it 25 kg, they make it 10 kg, so it can be affordable and can be bought by the quote unquote middle class Nigerians. But still, we have a sachet economy because the consumer has no purchasing power and cannot spend. Thus, it's like a supply side. Nobody's going to produce if no one's going to buy. So we have limited supply because the infrastructure makes it expensive to produce in Nigeria. It's cheaper to simply import and sell than to produce in Nigeria. So that's the problem, right? So how can we then solve this? I mean, build something that generates jobs, right? Take housing. One house generates give or take about 8 jobs, just one house, right? And that's going to be just the guys that are going to build it. What if we said we're going to build one Festac in Lagos and one Festac in Port Harcourt, one Festac in Abuja, and we're going to do this every 3 years, right? So look at the nails, the roofing sheets, the asphalt, the painters, the mortgage, lawyers, all that's going to happen. The people you're going to employ, right, in those clusters, the companies that are going to be set up just to supply roofing sheets, cement, and all that. The training, you have to go back to school and they try to train POP guys, plumbers, and all that. So you create this ecosystem around building homes. And there's an off-taker for homes, right? You and I would buy those homes. You get educational training, and you get people employed. If people are employed, people then can consume. If more people are consuming, you then get that initial bump of prices going up. But then you see the supply will then rush in to meet that. Because now, if I bring out a 50 kg of rice, people would buy. So as the prices are going to go up, more supply, local, international, will come in, and long-term will force prices down. So the summary of what I'm saying is that the Nigerian inflation is a supply side issue. And to fix it is not to, interest rate doesn't fix that. It's supply. If you increase the supply of rice, the price of rice goes down and the inflation rate in Nigeria goes down. Rice, of course, being food. Food makes up 6% of the budget of the Nigerian household. So anything you can do to bring down the cost of food, bring down the cost of food inflation, it brings down the CPI, which then brings down interest rate. So it's all linked. We've got to focus on food. Food alone can solve the problem of inflation in Nigeria. Yeah.
Right. Well, thank you so much. Let's have recommendation, all of these issues, all of these solutions. What do you think is the way forward for the government now? Evil.
What I would say is the government needs to tackle the problem of expenditure inefficiencies, because that's one of the biggest issues in the budget at the moment, and especially when it's linked to very powerful and very high-level politicians. It's difficult to solve the problem, but the government needs to find a place in its heart to consider the long-term implications of the inefficient spending currently going on. So that needs to be resolved. We recommend the budget should be amended to realign expenditures properly with the objectives of several agencies' mandates. That's one. Secondly, I would say the government needs to tackle food inflation. And to tackle that, or to take a stab at that problem, the government has to trash out the problem of food supply. And this is not just but this is not even to discredit the work CBN is doing by getting involved in giving out loans and things like that to people. I mean, the CBN is trying in those respects, but we think that's not even exactly its mandate. But what we think the government should do more is those agencies that are set up to ensure or optimize food production in Nigeria, all their expenditures should be aligned with that mandate. The agency responsible for mechanization of agriculture in Nigeria, all expenditures should be aligned to that. The agency responsible for preventing post-harvest losses for food and crops when they're harvested, that agency's expenditures should be aligned to that. So we need better alignment, especially with the agencies in the agricultural sector. That way we would have more efficient spending of public revenue on critical areas that can help improve food supply. The last recommendation is that there is a need for an improvement in how the government leverages public-private partnerships in a transparent way, because there is some, again, not a lot of capital in the private sector to meet our real needs, but there is some capital in the private sector that can be leveraged by the federal government. But the federal government needs to design the right structures and the right framework that will allow these private sector investors to invest in infrastructure in Nigeria in a safe and transparent manner.
All right. Thank you so much. Quite insightful. Kalu, how about you? Any parting thoughts?
Yeah, I just think for the budget, we have got to be a bit more longer term, maybe copy what China does. Where China does is 10-year budgets, and they agree on it. It's easy for them, they're a communist one-party state, but Nigeria can also do that. We already have this multi-year budgeting, but have a 10-year plan that the government cannot change. So whoever is the president, he knows he has to build 3 senatorial roads, 10 hospitals, blah, 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 all that kind of stuff. And then no one can change it. If we can just maybe do that and then maybe save 10% from revenues, just all revenues, 10% go to the Sovereign Wealth Fund, and the Sovereign Wealth Fund then funds this 10-year plan, irrespective of who is in power. That's a long way, right? So that would mean that all those projects that are done and agreed to in a 10-year cycle get done. People know they're going to get done. Whatever we sell in crude oil, 10% goes to the Sovereign Wealth Fund and they do it. The taxes also go there. Citizens become a bit more, okay, I know that these politicians can't get their hands on this. Okay, I'll pay the tax. So if we can link that spending to that plan, I think we'll get a better more in terms of the tax to revenue number that we're seeing right now. So that's what I'd like to see Nigeria do something.
Well, is it possible for that to actually happen in Nigeria?
Where do you do that in Nigeria? Where do you do that in Nigeria? I mean, look at how your pension funds are being managed. It's managed by private sector people.
Yes.
It's a federal scheme. So look at also the Sovereign Wealth Fund. They are the ones that are building the second Niger bridge. Nigeria is contributing just as a seed, but they are the ones building through a PPP with Julius Berger. So what if they build 4 bridges or 10 roads in that same model, using this new tax law that has been passed? Create an SPV by law, and you can ask Nigerian, even the diaspora, to invest in that SPV, right? And it's owned by quote unquote the Sovereign Wealth Fund. Put 10% of oil revenues direct, not net, gross, in there, direct. It just goes in there and put taxes in there and just tell these guys, no government can talk to you. You're going to go out and do seed funding or direct investment in infrastructure. That's a way to use this. If you live in the States and you invest in a US Treasury bond for 10 years, you get less than 1%. If that firm offers 3% on a dollar investment to build a train from Lagos to Calabar, why wouldn't I invest if I'm going to get my 3%? Why? I could take a loan here at 1%, invest in Nigeria at 3% as an impact fund, right? And I could then write it off on my taxes if Nigeria pitches that as an impact bond. So I go back and I write it off. So we're going to get a bit more creative. We're in a global village and we have to be a bit more creative in how we raise money and how we want to allocate. Borrowing. That's so 2000 and something. We have to move forward.
All right. Thank you so much, Abel. Thank you so much, Kalu. That was quite an interesting conversation. Abel Akeni is the head research and policy advisory at Budget Foundation, while Kalu Aja is the financial planner. Thank you guys for joining us today on this particular episode. Well, that's a wrap for us. You can keep the conversation going on our social media platforms. On Twitter, it's at BudgetNG. On Instagram, it's BudgetNG. And on Facebook, it's also BudgetNG. My name is Nancy Odumegu, and do have a lovely day.